The silence before dawn is when they hunt best. I learned this 3 weeks ago when the world ended, though I suppose it had been ending long before any of us noticed the signs. My name is irrelevant now. Names are luxuries for the living, and I'm not entirely sure which category I belong to anymore. What matters is that you understand what I'm about to tell you, because the rules I found might be the only thing standing between you and something far worse than death. The infected aren't just mindless corpses shambling through our streets. They're evolving, learning, and the conventional wisdom about zombie survival will get you killed in ways you never imagined. If you've stumbled across this recording, it means you're still breathing, still fighting, still clinging to the hope that tomorrow might exist. Subscribe if you want to live through the night, because what I'm about to share will challenge everything you think you know about survival. Here's a question that will haunt your dreams. What happens when the dead learn to think faster than the living? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller tonight, as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it in your corner of this dying world? And are you truly alone? The dead are always listening, so choose your words carefully when you comment. The notebook I found wasn't meant for me, but sometimes destiny chooses its messengers in the most unlikely ways. I discovered the blood-stained journal in what used to be a family restaurant on Highway 91, 3 days after my group had been reduced, from 12 survivors to just 4 of us. The leather cover was soft with moisture I didn't want to identify, and the pages were filled with meticulous handwriting that grew increasingly frantic toward the end. Sarah, Marcus, and Tony were scavenging the kitchen while I explored the manager's office, searching for anything useful: medication, weapons, food that hadn't spoiled in the weeks since the power grid failed. The notebook was tucked inside, a desk drawer that had been barricaded shut with a chair, as if someone had desperately wanted to keep it hidden but also accessible. The first entry was dated 6 days after the initial outbreak, written by someone who signed themselves only as The Watcher, and their observations chilled me more than the November air seeping through broken windows. They had documented behavioral patterns in the infected that I had noticed but hoped were just paranoid delusions brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. The infected were learning, adapting, displaying signs of coordination that defied every zombie movie I had ever seen. What terrified me most wasn't the detailed accounts of attacks and narrow escapes. It was the clinical precision with which the Watcher had analyzed the infected's evolution, as if they had been studying them rather than simply trying to survive them. The handwriting changed dramatically in the final entries, becoming shaky and erratic, with several pages torn out entirely, leaving only fragments of sentences that made my skin crawl. Mirrors show the truth. Children are the worst. Sound travels faster underground. But it was the last complete entry that made my hands tremble as I read it aloud to myself in the suffocating darkness of that office. The 5 rules were written in red ink that had dried to the color of rust, each one numbered and underlined, with the desperate urgency of someone who had paid a terrible price to learn these truths. Rule 1. Never make any noise after sunset. The infected hunt by sound in darkness, and their hearing becomes supernaturally acute once the sun disappears. Rule 2. Avoid mirrors and reflective surfaces at all costs. They reveal things about the infected that your mind isn't equipped to process, and once you see the truth, it cannot be unseen. Rule 3. Don't trust anyone who doesn't bleed when cut. The infected can mimic human behavior perfectly during daylight hours, but their blood runs black and thick like motor oil. Rule 4. Stay away from children, no matter how innocent or helpless they appear. Infected children retain more of their cognitive abilities and use emotional manipulation as their primary hunting strategy. Rule 5. Never go underground for any reason. Basements, sewers, subway tunnels, and caves are where they breed, and the things that emerge from those depths make surface-level infected look like harmless sleepwalkers. Each rule was followed, by detailed explanations written in increasingly desperate handwriting, describing encounters that had taught the watcher these lessons through witnessing unspeakable horrors. The margins were filled with additional notes, corrections, and warnings, scrawled in different colored inks, suggesting the notebook had been updated multiple times as new discoveries were made. At the bottom of the page, written in black ink that looked fresh compared to the rest, were the words, "These rules are not suggestions. They are the accumulated wisdom of the dead, transcribed by the dying, for the desperate." I called out. To the others, my voice barely above a whisper, but in the silence that followed I realized something had changed in the atmosphere of the restaurant. The normal sounds of my companions moving through the kitchen had stopped entirely, replaced by a stillness that felt like held breath. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded me too much of the dried blood staining the notebook's pages. The first rule shattered like glass against concrete when Tony sneezed. It was barely 8 p.m., full darkness having settled over the restaurant like a burial shroud, and we had been whispering our plans for the next day's route when his allergies betrayed us all. The sound was sharp, sudden, innocent, the kind of noise that would have been meaningless in the world we used to inhabit, but in this new reality, it might as well have been a dinner bell. I grabbed Tony's arm, pressing my finger to my lips, with such urgency that his eyes went wide with understanding, but the damage was already done. The silence that followed his sneeze stretched for exactly 17 seconds. I know because I counted each one like a countdown to execution, before the first response came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the broken front windows. It started as a low moan, barely audible, like wind through dead leaves, but then it was joined by another voice and another, until the night filled with a harmonious symphony of hunger that made my bones ache with terror. Sarah grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging into my skin hard enough to draw blood, and I could feel her pulse hammering against my palm like a trapped bird. The infected began to arrive within minutes, their shambling footsteps creating a rhythm against the asphalt parking lot that sounded like rainfall, except rain had never made the windows rattle with anticipation. Through gaps in the boards we had nailed over the restaurant's entrance, I could see shapes moving in the darkness. Not the stumbling, uncoordinated movements I had expected, but deliberate, purposeful positioning that suggested strategy rather than mindless hunger. They surrounded the building methodically, cutting off escape routes with the precision of a military unit, and I realized with growing horror that they were communicating with each other through sounds too low for human ears to detect. Marcus whispered that we should make a run for it, but I showed him the notebook, pointing to Rule 1 with a trembling finger, because the Watcher had written in detail about what happened to survivors who tried to flee after dark. They were herded like cattle toward predetermined killing grounds where the infected waited with infinite patience. The mirror in the restaurant's bathroom became our second nightmare when Sarah insisted she needed to check a wound on her shoulder where broken glass had cut her during our earlier escape from the hardware store. I should have stopped her, should have remembered the Watcher's warning about reflective surfaces, but exhaustion had dulled my judgment, and the immediate threat of the infected surrounding our building had pushed the notebook's other rules to the back of my mind. She used her phone's flashlight to illuminate the cracked mirror above the sink, angling it to examine the jagged cut that had been bleeding intermittently throughout the day. What she saw in that reflection made her scream. Not the sharp, startled cry of someone surprised by pain, but the raw, primal shriek of a mind encountering something it cannot process or accept. I rushed into the bathroom to find her standing, frozen before the mirror, her face white as bone, pointing at her reflection with a shaking hand. In the mirror, Sarah's reflection was moving independently, its mouth opening and closing in perfect synchronization with the moans we could hear from the infected outside, its eyes completely black like pools of oil, its head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a living person's neck. The reflection raised its hand in a mocking wave, and I watched in paralyzed horror as Sarah's actual hand began to rise against her will, muscle and bone responding to commands from something that wasn't her, I grabbed her shoulders and spun her away from the mirror, breaking whatever hold the reflection had established, but the damage was already done. The infected outside had heard her scream, and their moaning intensified into something that sounded almost like laughter, as if they knew we had discovered another piece of the puzzle they wanted us to solve. Sarah's eyes remained black for nearly an hour afterward, and during that time, she spoke in a voice that wasn't entirely her own, describing things she couldn't possibly have seen. The layout of underground tunnels beneath our city, the breeding, chambers where new infected were being transformed, the intelligence that coordinated their movements like a hive mind with purposes beyond simple hunger. When her eyes finally returned to their normal brown, she had no memory of what she had said, but I wrote down every word in the margins of the Watcher's notebook. Marcus failed the bleeding test on our 4th day in the restaurant, though I suspect he had been infected much longer than any of us realized. The discovery came when Tony accidentally cut Marcus with a kitchen knife while we were opening cans of food we had scavenged from the pantry. The blade sliced across Marcus's palm, a shallow wound that should have produced the familiar crimson of human blood. But instead, a thick black substance oozed from the cut like crude oil mixed with tar. The smell hit us immediately. Sweet decay mixed with something chemical and wrong, like flowers rotting in formaldehyde. Marcus stared at his palm with what I first interpreted as surprise, but as the seconds ticked by, his expression shifted into something resembling relief, as if a burden he had been carrying was finally lifted. He had been complaining of headaches for the past week, unusual fatigue, and a persistent metallic taste in his mouth that he attributed to stress and poor nutrition. Now we understood that these had been symptoms of a transformation so gradual that even he hadn't noticed the fundamental changes occurring within his body. The black blood continued to seep from the wound, but it moved with purpose, flowing upward against gravity toward his wrist as if seeking to return to its source. Marcus began to speak, but his voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords cannot produce, explaining that he had been infected during our escape from the shopping mall 5 days earlier when a child had scratched his ankle through his jeans. He described the infection process from the inside, how consciousness gradually splits between human awareness and something vast and interconnected, how individual thoughts become part of a collective intelligence that spans continents, how the infected don't see humans as food but as raw material for expansion. The most terrifying part wasn't his transformation, but his complete lack of distress about it, as if he had found something better than humanity and couldn't understand why we were so frightened. As darkness fell and Rule 1 took effect again, Marcus walked outside to join the infected surrounding our building, and through the boarded windows we could hear him having conversations with them in that inhuman, harmonic language, discussing us like specimens in a laboratory experiment. The child appeared on our 5th day, and every instinct I possessed screamed at me to help her, even as Rule 4 echoed in my mind like a warning bell I couldn't silence. She looked maybe 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a pink dress that had once been pretty, but was now stained with substances I didn't want to identify. She stood in the parking lot just beyond the range where the adult infected waited, calling for help in a voice so perfectly pitched to trigger parental protective instincts that my chest physically ached. Sarah immediately moved toward the window, her maternal instincts overriding the survival wisdom we had learned, but I caught her arm and forced her to read Rule 4 again, pointing to the Watcher's detailed explanation of why infected children were the most dangerous. The child claimed her name was Emma, that she had been hiding in a car for days without food or water, that her parents were dead and she was scared and alone. Her performance was flawless. Tears at exactly the right moments, just enough weakness in her voice to suggest dehydration, small details about her fictional parents that made her story heartbreakingly believable. But I noticed things that the Watcher had taught me to look for. Her clothes were dirty but not weathered by days of outdoor exposure. Her skin showed no signs of dehydration despite her claims, and most tellingly, the adult infected maintained a precise 15-foot perimeter around her as if she were radioactive. When we didn't immediately respond to her pleas, Emma's demeanor shifted subtly. Her tears stopped falling mid-sob, her posture straightened, and her voice took on a calculating edge that no 7-year-old should possess. She began describing things she claimed to have seen, safe houses we had never told anyone about, the names of survivors from other groups we had encountered weeks earlier, intimate details about our relationships and fears that she couldn't possibly have known. The performance evolved into psychological warfare designed to make us doubt each other and ourselves, with Emma playing the role of innocent child while demonstrating knowledge that could only come from a collective intelligence that had been watching and learning about us for far longer than we had been aware of its existence. Tony wanted to let her in, arguing that she was just scared and that we couldn't abandon a child regardless of the rules. But I showed him the Watcher's final note about children. They remember being human just enough to perfect the mimicry, but they've forgotten enough to make the betrayal absolute. The subway entrance called to us like a siren song when our food supplies dwindled to nothing but stale crackers and contaminated water, despite Rule 5's absolute prohibition against going underground. The metro station was only 2 blocks from the restaurant, easily accessible through back alleys that would minimize our exposure to the infected, and Tony argued that the underground tunnels would be safer than street-level scavenging, where we were constantly visible to hostile eyes. I read Rule 5 aloud multiple times, emphasizing the Watcher's warning that underground spaces were breeding grounds where something worse than surface infection occurred. But desperation has a way of making even the most terrifying options seem reasonable when the alternative is slow starvation. Sarah supported Tony's position, pointing out that subway stations typically contained vending machines, maintenance supplies, and potentially functional communication equipment that might help us contact other survivor groups. The logical part of my mind acknowledged their arguments while the primal part screamed warnings I couldn't articulate, a visceral terror of descending into darkness that felt older than human civilization. We spent hours debating the decision while our stomachs cramped with hunger and the infected outside maintained their patient vigil, occasionally tapping against the windows in rhythms that sounded almost like Morse code. I noticed that Emma had disappeared sometime during the night, but the adult infected remained in their positions, suggesting that her role in whatever was being orchestrated around us had been completed. The notebook felt heavier in my hands each time I consulted it, as if the weight of the Watcher's accumulated knowledge was literally increasing, and I began to understand that these weren't just survival rules, but warnings from someone who had witnessed the true scope of what humanity was facing. By afternoon, our dehydration had reached dangerous levels, and Tony was showing signs of heat exhaustion despite the November cold, his skin pale and clammy, his hands shaking with a tremor that had nothing to do with fear. The subway entrance waited in the gathering dusk like an open mouth, promising shelter and resources while the Watcher's words burned in my memory. What emerges from the depths makes surface dwellers look like angels. Everything unraveled when we broke multiple rules simultaneously in a cascade of desperation that felt orchestrated by forces beyond our understanding. Sarah made noise after sunset when she stumbled over debris in our rush toward the subway entrance. Tony had been checking his reflection in store windows throughout our journey despite my warnings about mirrors, and I realized with growing horror that we were being herded exactly where something wanted us to go. The infected that had surrounded the restaurant for days suddenly abandoned their positions, creating clear pathways that led directly toward the metro station, their behavior shifting from predatory patience to active guidance. Sarah's black-eyed episode from the bathroom mirror began to make terrible sense. She had been marked, tagged with some form of supernatural GPS that allowed the collective intelligence to track our movements and influence our decisions. The child, Emma, reappeared as we approached the subway entrance, no longer maintaining her innocent facade but walking alongside the adult infected with casual familiarity, her 7-year-old face wearing an expression of ancient patience that made my skin crawl. Tony's reflection in a broken storefront window showed him from angles that were physically impossible, as if multiple cameras were observing him simultaneously, and I realized that every reflective surface had become an eye in a vast surveillance network that had been cataloging our habits, fears, and weaknesses. The notebook felt like it was burning in my backpack, the watcher's warnings transforming from helpful advice into a cruel joke. We had been given the rules not to help us survive, but to make our inevitable capture more entertaining for whatever intelligence orchestrated this nightmare. As we descended the first steps into the subway station, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of a single footfall, and the darkness below seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The infected followed us down in perfect formation, no longer pretending to be mindless predators but revealing themselves as components of a larger organism that had been playing with us like a cat with mice. Emma skipped past us on the stairs, her childish laughter echoing off tiled walls and harmonics that suggested the tunnel system was designed to amplify and distort sound in ways that would drive human minds to madness. The safe house became a trap. The moment we realized every rule we had broken had been precisely calculated to drive us to this exact location at this specific time. The restaurant had never been refuge. It was a holding pen designed to keep us contained while we were studied, analyzed, and prepared for whatever purpose we were meant to serve. The infected that had surrounded us for days hadn't been trying to get in. They had been making sure we couldn't get out until the proper conditions were met. Sarah's wound from the hardware store, Marcus's infection timeline, Tony's increasing reliance on reflective surfaces to check for injuries. Every detail had been orchestrated with surgical precision by an intelligence that understood human psychology better than we understood ourselves. The notebook itself was part of the trap. The Watcher's rules designed not to help us survive, but to ensure we would break each one in a specific sequence that would lead us exactly where we were supposed to go. I flipped through the blood-stained pages with mounting horror, noticing details I had missed in my initial reading. The handwriting wasn't from one person but from dozens of different survivors, each adding their own observations and discoveries, each group of humans guided through the same predetermined path we were now following. The dates on various entries spanned months, suggesting this process had been repeated again and again with other survivor groups, each one believing they had found salvation in the form of survival rules while actually following a script written by something that viewed human behavior as predictably as a mathematical equation. The restaurant's layout, our scavenging routes, even our decision to split into smaller groups had all been influenced by subtle environmental factors designed to shape our choices without us realizing we were being guided. Every mirror we had encountered, every child that had appeared to us, every infected individual whose behavior seemed slightly off, they were all components of an elaborate psychological experiment with a purpose I was only beginning to comprehend. As we descended deeper into the subway system, following pathways that seemed to glow with their own phosphorescent light, I understood that we had never been survivors. We had been test subjects in a study of human desperation, and the real experiment was just beginning. The weight of watching others die according to the script crushed whatever remained of my sanity, as Tony succumbed to his mirror obsession in ways the Watcher had documented with clinical precision. His need to constantly check his reflection had evolved from practical concern about injuries into compulsive behavior that consumed every moment of his waking consciousness, his eyes darting toward any reflective surface with the desperate hunger of an addict seeking a fix. In the subway tunnels, with their polished metal surfaces and pools of stagnant water that acted like black mirrors, Tony's condition accelerated beyond anything I could have predicted. He began seeing things and reflections that weren't there in reality. Conversations with people who had died weeks ago, entire landscapes that existed only in the mirror world, versions of himself that moved independently and offered advice that grew increasingly dangerous. The psychological deterioration was systematic, following stages the Watcher had outlined in painful detail. First, the obsession with self-examination, then the inability to distinguish between reflection and reality. Finally, the complete integration with whatever intelligence controlled the mirror network. Tony began arguing with his reflection, having heated discussions about strategy and survival that made no sense to those of us watching from the real world. but I could see in his eyes that he was receiving information from sources beyond our understanding. When he finally walked into a mirrored wall and simply vanished, not through the glass but into it, as if the reflective surface was a doorway rather than a barrier, Sarah screamed until her voice gave out entirely. The sound echoed through the subway tunnels in frequencies that seemed to activate dormant machinery, lights flickering to life in sections that should have been powerless, ventilation systems humming with renewed activity despite the infrastructure collapse that had occurred weeks earlier. I realized that human screams, like everything else in this nightmare, served multiple purposes: emotional release for the screaming individual, psychological warfare against remaining survivors, and activation signals for technology that had been waiting in darkness for the proper auditory keys. The notebook trembled in my hands as I read the Watcher's entry about mirrors. They don't show alternate realities. They show the reality we're not allowed to see. And once you've seen it, you belong to it completely. The truth about the Watcher's identity revealed itself in handwriting analysis that made my blood freeze in recognition as I compared the journal entries to my own penmanship from before the outbreak. The early entries, written in neat cursive, belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, whose research notes I had seen during my brief employment at the Centers for Disease Control before budget cuts eliminated my position. The middle entries in block letters came from someone who signed themselves as Survivor 23, suggesting a numbering system that implied at least 22 previous test subjects had contributed to the notebook's contents. But the final entries, the ones written in desperate scrawl that became increasingly illegible, were in handwriting identical to my own, as if I had written them during episodes of consciousness I couldn't remember. Buried in the notebook's back pages, I found photocopies of CDC documents bearing my signature, research proposals I had submitted months before the outbreak began, theoretical models for behavioral manipulation during catastrophic events that read like blueprints for everything we had experienced. The infected hadn't evolved naturally. They were the result of experimental protocols I had helped design, psychological warfare techniques disguised as survival research, methods for studying, human decision-making under extreme stress that had been implemented on a global scale. My own research had provided the framework for understanding how desperate people would respond to specific stimuli, how survival instincts could be weaponized and redirected, how groups of humans could be guided through predetermined scenarios while believing they were making independent choices. The notebook was my own research notes, compiled from multiple iterations of the same experiment, with each group of survivors adding their observations to a database that grew more comprehensive with each completed cycle. I remembered submitting the proposal, remembered the excitement of potential breakthrough applications in emergency psychology, but the implementation had gone far beyond anything I had imagined or authorized. Sarah found me sitting in the tunnel reading my own handwriting from a future I couldn't remember living, my hands shaking so violently that the pages rustled like autumn leaves, and when she asked what I had discovered, I couldn't form words to explain that we were laboratory rats in a maze I had helped design. Desperation drove us deeper into the tunnel system when the surface world became completely untenable, despite knowing that Rule 5 existed for reasons we were about to discover, in the most visceral way possible. The subway platform where we had taken shelter was invaded by something that made the surface infected look like harmless sleepwalkers, creatures that had once been human but had undergone transformation so complete that species identification became impossible. They moved with liquid grace through spaces that should have been too narrow for passage, their limbs extending and contracting like rubber hoses filled with water, their faces cycling through dozens of different human expressions, as if they were trying on identities like masks. The air itself became toxic at deeper levels, filled with spores that made us see things that weren't there while preventing us from seeing things that were, a hallucinogenic atmosphere that turned navigation into guesswork and made communication nearly impossible. Sarah began aging rapidly in the contaminated environment, her hair turning gray within hours, her skin developing wrinkles and spots that suggested decades of damage compressed into minutes of exposure. The notebook's pages began writhing in my hands like living tissue, the ink rearranging itself to form new warnings about hazards we were discovering in real time. Depth increases transformation speed. Sound amplification drives madness. Light sources reveal things better left hidden. Every step deeper into the underground network brought us closer to something vast and pulsing that felt like the heart of whatever had orchestrated the surface outbreak, a central intelligence that regarded human consciousness as raw material for experiments that served purposes beyond our comprehension. The tunnel walls began showing us our memories, projecting scenes from our lives onto surfaces that acted like organic video screens, forcing us to relive traumatic experiences while simultaneously showing us alternate versions of those same events where different choices led to different outcomes. We were no longer moving through physical space but through psychological terrain designed to map the complete contents of our minds, extracting every thought, fear, hope, and memory for analysis and storage. Emma appeared again, but now she was dozens of different children simultaneously, each one representing a different aspect of innocence that had been weaponized against parental instincts, her multiplied voices explaining that the underground was where new forms of existence were being born from the raw materials of human desperation. The tunnel system opened into a vast underground chamber that defied architectural possibility, its walls stretching beyond the range of our flashlight beams, while the ceiling disappeared into darkness so complete it seemed to absorb illumination, rather than simply lacking it. In the center of this impossible space stood structures that looked grown rather than built, organic towers that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns suggesting communication networks beyond human understanding. The infected we had encountered on the surface were revealed to be merely the first stage of a transformation process that continued far beyond death, with more advanced forms moving through the chamber with purpose and intelligence that made our surface experiences look like encounters with training simulations. Sarah collapsed as soon as we entered the chamber, her rapid aging accelerating until she appeared decades older than her actual years, her voice becoming the whisper of someone whose time was measured in moments rather than years. She used her remaining strength to point toward the organic towers, explaining in fractured sentences that the structures were not buildings but nervous systems, vast biological computers that processed consciousness like data, extracting human experience and integrating it into something larger that spanned multiple dimensions of existence. The notebook in my hands began dissolving, its pages breaking down into constituent molecules that flowed toward the nearest tower like metal filings drawn to a magnet, carrying with it all the accumulated knowledge of previous survivor groups, all the observations and discoveries that had been made by test subjects who had followed the same path through the maze of orchestrated survival. I understood with crystalline clarity that we had never been fighting for our lives. We had been contributing to a harvest of human consciousness that served as fuel for something so vast and alien that our minds could only perceive tiny fragments of its true nature. The chamber filled with sounds that suggested activity on a massive scale, machinery or biology operating according to principles that made no distinction between technology and organic life, processing the contents of human minds like a factory converting raw materials into finished products. Emma materialized beside me, no longer maintaining any pretense of childhood but revealing herself as something that had never been human, her form shifting between different configurations as she explained that the surface outbreak had been merely the collection phase of an operation designed to catalog and preserve human consciousness before the species became extinct through natural evolutionary pressures. The rules had never been about survival. They were feeding instructions designed to ensure that human consciousness would be harvested at peak desperation and fear, seasoned with exactly the right mixture of hope and terror to make the final product maximally useful for purposes I couldn't begin to comprehend. Each rule we had broken had been a trigger that activated different aspects of the harvesting process, with our violations carefully timed and orchestrated to ensure we would arrive at the underground chamber in precisely the psychological state required for optimal extraction. The mirror encounters had been consciousness mapping sessions, cataloging our memories and personality structures so they could be preserved intact during the harvesting process. The bleeding tests had identified which individuals were already partially integrated into the collective intelligence and which ones still retained enough independent consciousness to be worth processing separately. The sound restrictions after dark had been training protocols designed to heighten our auditory sensitivity until we became capable of hearing the subsonic communication frequencies used by the harvesting machinery. The avoidance of infected children had ensured we wouldn't bond with entities that might complicate the extraction process through emotional attachment. The prohibition against underground travel had been designed to build psychological pressure until we were desperate, enough to violate the final rule and deliver ourselves directly to the processing facility. Standing in that impossible chamber, watching Sarah age and dissolve into component molecules that were absorbed by the organic towers, I realized that every choice we had made, every decision that felt like independent human agency, had been the result of environmental manipulation so subtle and pervasive that free will itself had become an illusion. The notebook's dissolution had transferred all our accumulated experiences into the central processing system, where they would be analyzed, cataloged, and integrated into a vast library of human consciousness that served as the foundation for something that regarded individual human existence as insignificant as cells in a biological organism. Emma's final explanation, delivered in harmonics that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my brain, revealed that the surface world had been restored to its pre-outbreak condition within hours of our descent into the tunnels, with new populations of humans already being introduced to begin the next cycle of behavioral research, each generation believing they were the first to face these challenges while actually following scripts written in the dissolved remains of their predecessors. The transmission you're hearing now comes from somewhere between existence and memory, a space where consciousness persists after the body has been processed, but before the mind has been fully integrated into the collective archive of human experience. I want you to understand that the rules I shared with you weren't meant to help you survive. They were meant to ensure you would fail in exactly the right ways, at exactly the right times, to feed something that regards your thoughts and fears as delectable cuisine for appetites that transcend human comprehension. Sarah dissolved into data streams that were absorbed by machinery that defied every law of physics and biology, her final moments of consciousness cataloged and stored like vintage wine in a cellar that spans dimensions beyond spatial reality. The surface world where you're listening to this has already been reset, scrubbed clean of infection, and repopulated with fresh humans who believe they're living in the first days of a zombie apocalypse, when in reality they're the latest batch of test subjects in experiments that have been running for longer than human civilization has existed. Every zombie movie you've ever watched, every survival guide you've read, every emergency preparation you've made has been influenced by data extracted from previous iterations of this process, cultural artifacts designed to ensure you'll respond predictably when your turn comes to contribute to the harvest. The infected you fear are shepherds rather than predators, guiding each generation of humans through carefully designed scenarios that extract maximum psychological and emotional content before the final processing phase begins in chambers buried so deep beneath the earth that they exist in spaces where geography becomes irrelevant. If you found this recording, it means you've been selected for the next cycle, chosen based on psychological profiles that predict exactly how you'll break under pressure. What fears will drive your decisions? What hopes will sustain you long enough to complete the journey from surface to depth? Like this video if you can still move your fingers independently, subscribe if you think you can escape what's already been written in the dissolved remains of countless predecessors, and remember that every rule designed to help you survive is actually a recipe for your own destruction, seasoned with just enough hope to keep you struggling until the very end. Sweet dreams, and remember, they're always listening, even in the spaces between thoughts where you believe you're alone.